that word you use?
Spoilers.
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 Spoilers. Spoilers. Spoilers.
I like that word.
I thought you might.
Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of A Brief History, and today we're going to be kicking off a new three-part series. A complete guide to the multi-platform story of TimeLord Victorious, with the emphasis on complete, which we'll come back to in a moment. Now, first things first, in the past I have had the occasional comment about how for a series called A Brief History, the videos aren't that brief. But when you consider that to cover the history for just one character in the Doctor Who universe, including all of its expanded medias, where just an audio story can be 1 to 2 hours long, then subjectively, these videos are brief. So with that in mind, if you're looking for a short, quick explanation of TimeLord Victorious, or expecting me to jump right into explaining it, then I'm sorry, but this video won't be for you. Not only is there a lot of information to get through, but because I'm trying to do as comprehensive of an overview as I possibly can, it does mean it will take some time to explain. Now, I previously mentioned the emphasis on complete for this guide, because whilst there are already various charts and timelines and orders out there, I did notice two things with a lot of them. One, some of them don't include all of the pieces of the narrative information, and two, they also don't necessarily include the exact order that they're supposed to go in, as some stories do take place in between other ones. And for that very reason, I have created this chart, and I even have a special pointer, in reality the remote control stick from a Dalek, to do my pointing. So what you see here is an entire selection of every piece of media that relates in some way back to the main TimeLord Victorious story, even if it's only a minor reference. However, it is worth saying that all of the pieces here will not necessarily be used, but I've included them to try and keep it as comprehensive as possible, so people wanting to collect all of the referencing material can see how much there is, and for those who just want the pieces of the story, know what to get. Now, as you can see, I have broken it down into several categories. First up, we have audio, which comprises Genetics of the Daleks, the short trips Master Thief and Lesser Evils, the Big Finish audios, Echoes of Extinction, He Kills Me, He Kills Me Not, Enemy of My Enemy, and Mutually Assured Destruction, and then the BBC audios, The Minds of Magnox, and lastly, Bernie Summerfield, Lost in Translation Volume 6 from Big Finish. Next we have comics, which comprises of the Doctor Who magazine Panini Comics Monstrous Beauty. Then we have the comic Defender of the Daleks. Then we have episodes 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 of the comic creators Tales of the Dark Times. And then lastly, the Four Doctors comic. Eagle Moss is pretty self-explanatory, as this is each of the magazines which came with the Eagle Moss selections, which each have an individual piece of a story. Although I have to say the fourth one doesn't have an individual piece of the story, but I've included it there simply for the purposes of collecting everything together. Newsletter is what compromises all of the different pieces that came with the Doctor Who e-newsletter that you could sign up for. So these are the Secrets of the TimeLord Victorious, Dawn of the Couture, or Couturov. I'm going to pronounce that several ways in this video, so bear with me. The short story Canaries, which was later featured in the digital releases of the Wintertime Paradox book, and what the TimeLord thought, what the TARDIS thought, sorry, of the TimeLord Victorious. Then we have novels, which compromises River Song's Guide to the Dark Times from the official 2021 annual, the exclusive Brian the Ood t-shirt, which has an exclusive piece of narrative on it, the books The Night, The Fall and the Dead, and All Flesh is Grass. Then we have online, which compromises 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 episodes of the TV series, or the online series I should say, Daleks. We then have the trailer for Genetics of the Daleks, and then a trailer for TimeLord Victorious entitled The Last Message. And then we have TV, which encompasses the release of Road to the Dark Times, but really the only episode of this that I really need to address is in fact The Waters of Mars. And you're probably wondering why I left it out. I didn't know, I was just leaving it until the very last. We have Immersive, because that is the one that encompasses the most. We have the Doctor Who Edge of Time game. We have logs 1, 2, 3 and 4 from the Time Fracture YouTube releases. We then have the Time Fracture trailer itself. We have an extra piece from the end of log 3, which has a sort of Morse code. I included that there because it seemed like it was too much of a hint to ignore. We then have the Lonely Assassin's game, the time fracture itself, and then the downloadable, buyable, play-at-home game, The Hollow Planet, and lastly, the Dalek Awakens interactive escape room. So there, more or less, we have everything, but the real question now, is how does it all go together? Well, that's where it gets a little bit complicated, because there isn't really a single main plot, although we'll come back to that in a moment. So with that in mind, I'm going to do several different threads and colour code them, which you can see here. So we have the 8th Doctor will be in green, the 9th Doctor will be in orange, the 10th Doctor will be in blue, the Daleks will be in yellow, Brian the Ood will be in black, the Couture will be in purple, and then, if possible, a main narrative in pink. Now the main narrative is going to be my attempt to try and work out which stories are the most plot integral and a general overall plot. And at the time of recording, I have absolutely no idea whether or not that is going to work. But that is getting ahead of things, which is where we come to this being done in 3 parts. Today, part 1 will be the 8th and 9th Doctor storylines, part 2 will be the 10th Doctor and Daleks, and then part 3 will be Brian, the Couture, and then, if possible, a main narrative storyline. But today we are going to be doing the 8th and 9th Doctors, and that, in a way, already presents something of a problem. At the time of recording, due to COVID, the time fracture event has been pushed back several times, and subsequently we don't have any confirmation if the 8th or 9th Doctors will feature in the time fracture event or not. However, from what has been revealed so far, it would seem that they aren't, or at the very least they are not directly involved. However, it will be likely that there will be 1 or 2 references to them, as the one thing that we do know is that in order for them to both reach the Dark Times, they travelled there through the time fracture itself. Again, we're going to come back to that in a moment. So I have decided that if the 8th and 9th Doctors are directly involved in the time fracture event, I will include in the pinned comment exactly where their involvement is placed in their storylines. But now we get on to our actual history lesson, and we are going to begin with the 8th Doctor. And for this, because I'm colour coding it, I have many different colours of strings. So if you'll bear with me in a moment, I will attach up the 8th Doctor's wand and take you all through it. So, here we have the 8th Doctor's timeline laid out, and as you can see, it is very, very complicated. Be thankful you're only having to hear me talk about it. I had to go through some research, and I've lost count how many times I had to go back through this and change things and update things. But even before we start with the 8th Doctor's timeline, we have to make note of Secrets of the TimeLord Victorious number 6. Which isn't actually necessarily part of his timeline, but does relate back into it, because Secrets of the TimeLord Victorious Volume 6, I'm going to try and do this as spoiler-free as I can for those who want to try and follow all of this, especially the more larger bits of the narrative, but the smaller bits such as the newsletter, they're not hugely spoilerific, so it doesn't matter. But in Secrets of the TimeLord Victorious, more specifically entry number 6, which doesn't exactly relate into his timeline as a whole, but makes mention of his alliance with the Daleks, which does come later in Enemy of My Enemy. And so whilst it isn't necessarily part of his narrative, it is specifically mentioned that he is allying himself with the Daleks. So it's part of his narrative without being part of it, which is why I haven't joined it up, but for the sake of being comprehensive, it is worth mentioning. But as I said, we start over here with Echoes of Extinction, and this is actually something of a prequel to TimeLord Victorious. So for the 8th Doctor, he is currently on his way to trying to find the opening night of the Braxiatel collection, which is one of the 700 wonders of the universe, which we are going to come back to in a minute in He Kills Me Not. But in trying to find it, he comes across a space station, and on this space station he comes across a young woman with a robot butler of sorts, and an alien being who has to kill anyone it meets. And essentially, without going into too many plot details, and again trying to keep this video as short as possible, the 8th Doctor manages to defeat the monster, sort of, because he separates it out, sends one half down to a planet, which comes later with the 10th Doctor's version, which will be covered in a future video, but the robot butler also becomes inhabited by this being. And in the end, it ends up with the 8th Doctor heading off to the Shadow Proclamation to later return with a fleet and warning anybody to stay away from the planet. Of course, as the second part of this story will later reveal, that doesn't quite ring true, but we will come back to that later. Either way, this story then leads into He Kills Me Not, which is where the 8th Doctor, still on course for trying to find the 700 wonders of the universe, lands on the planet Arthana. And this, at the same time, is also where he meets Brian the Ood for the first time, becoming embroiled in Brian's latest contract, given he is an assassin, which takes up the main sort of narrative of this story. But it is also during this time, at a period when Brian and the Doctor are on their own, that we head over to The Night, the Fool and the Dead, and the third interlude, which is a conversation between Brian and the 8th Doctor, which happens during this time. And also, during the course of this story, the Doctor is actually on the phone. And it is at this point that I personally believe that the part of the story, the newsletter story, Canaries, takes place. Because during this story, the author of the story revealed on Reddit that of the Doctors that appear in this story, one of them is the 8th Doctor, and he is on the phone in this story to a curator, not the curator, although the curator does appear in the story. He is on the phone to a curator about the artifacts that she has and the fact that it is a sign of dark times to come. Now, obviously, the fact that he is on the phone in He Kills Me Not, and he is phoning someone up here in the midst of battle, it seems logical that this is probably around the same time that this happens, so obviously we follow that back then to the end of He Kills Me Not, which sees Brian temporarily joining the 8th Doctor upon his TARDIS before being ejected into the time vortex by accident, and the Doctor then finds himself surrounded and captured by Daleks, with whom he forms an alliance. Now, it's at this point we should take another short little sidestep, again not part of the main narrative, but it is worth noting that at the end of the comic Defender of the Daleks, the Dalek Emperor makes note of forming an alliance with the Doctor. More specifically, having previously failed to form an alliance with the 10th Doctor, they decide to form an alliance with the 8th, which leads into the enemy of my enemy. And it is also worth saying that this is kind of where the actual Dark Times era, or the actual Time Lord Victorious era, starts for the 8th Doctor, because previously he had an inkling that something was wrong when the planet he visited in He Kills Me Not was a desert planet when it shouldn't have been. But in this version of this particular story, not only does he find himself confronted with essentially new Daleks, but the Daleks themselves are trying to form a peaceful alliance with a race that, as far as the Doctor realises and knows, shouldn't exist, or shouldn't still exist. And it is at this point that he realises that there are issues, and by the end of the story he decides to venture into the Dark Times, which is where we follow this thread here over to What the TARDIS Thought from the newsletter. Now, the events of What the TARDIS Thought of the Time Lord Victorious actually take place during, or I should say just after, the events of the Waters of Mars. However, because it's written from the TARDIS's perspective, it is sort of time ambiguous in the sense of that the TARDIS addresses several things as has happened, will happen, is going to happen, sort of things like that. But the TARDIS makes mention specifically of how it will use the time fracture in order to get the retrospective Doctors, 8th, 9th and 10th, into the Dark Times. So in a way, this does form part of the narrative, because this explains how they actually get into the Dark Times. Which brings us down here to episode 3 of Tales of the Dark Times. In this story, the Doctor and the Dalek Time Squad stumble across a ship which is the remnants of a race that has been doomed to death by the Couture, or however it's pronounced. And they manage to locate the source of Huon particles and absorb it. However, during this time, at this point, by absorbing the Huon particles, they land themselves in a small world of trouble, and the Doctor once again manages to save the day. The Daleks thank the Doctor for being their saviour. He is, of course, again, very much not trusting them. But from this point, we then move on to the end of The Night, the Fool and the Dead, in which the 8th Doctor, alongside the 9th Doctor, turns up to try and talk sense into the 10th Doctor, who by this time has become the Time Lord Victorious. This then leads into All the Flesh is Grass, but more specifically chapters 1 to 4, because at chapter 4 the 8th and 9th Doctors go off and they actually form an alliance here in episode 5 of Tales of the Dark Times. However, just before we get into this part of Tales of the Dark Times, it is worth noting that it is during this time that the 8th Doctor goes off with the 9th that the story Mission to the Known from the Eagle Moss number 2 set takes place. Again, it is not exactly part of this narrative, but it is the time that this takes place, so it's worth pointing out this for the sake of the placement. But now we get back to Tales of the Dark Times episode 5. They don't, however, find the TimeLord Victorious, but they do find a dead time traveller and her time ship. However, the time traveller begins to come back to life, and the Doctors explain that this is due to the effects of her trying to travel back to the Big Bang and accidentally into the Dark Times. Luckily, they manage to save her and send her on her way, at which point they continue their search for the TimeLord Victorious, which brings us back to the end of All Flesh is Grass, where the events carry on as they carry on as part of the story. The Doctors all band together, manage to defeat the Katura, and then the 9th and 10th Doctors go their separate ways, but the 8th Doctor finds himself back on a Dalek timeship which begins disintegrating due to the events of the story, which leads into Mutually Assured Destruction, the final audio. In Mutually Assured Destruction, the Doctor is now once again, as I said, on a disintegrating Dalek ship and having to escape by any means he can and get back to his TARDIS, which he had previously left there on the Dalek ship, also managing to save a couple of captives of the Daleks along the way and make his way back through the time fracture out of the Dark Times. And that is sort of where the 8th Doctor's timeline ends, but it is worth noting at this point as well that the story Exit Strategy from Eagle Moss release 3 and also the Edge of Time update, which I'm going to come back to in a second, that is where these stories take place after the events of Mutually Assured Destruction. Now the Edge of the Eagle Moss Exit Strategy story was included as part of that. Now the Edge of Time, the reason I believe that takes place here is because during Exit Strategy, a Executioner Dalek is in the process of being destroyed during that story. And I have to give a big shout out here to DoctorBlue, another fantastic YouTuber who has given me permission to put up some of his footage of his Edge of Time playthrough, because I haven't played it myself. In this game, a Dalek Executioner arm is one of the things you pick up. And so I would say that the reason it's there, it's worth saying as well that during the Edge of Time, it's not actually a narrative story, it is really just a collectibles thing. So it doesn't have any sort of real narrative, but in terms of the reason why there would be a single Dalek Executioner claw hanging around, it can't be ignored the fact that there is one scene being destroyed in Exit Strategy and then one appears in the Edge of Time. So I believe those are the final parts of the 8th Doctor's timeline. So there you have it. That sort of shows the sort of thing we're going to be doing over the course of this video. It is rather complicated, as you can see. But there you have the 8th Doctors. Now, I am going to come back to both of these, but let's crack on and take a look at the 9th Doctors. So here we have the 9th Doctor's timeline added. Again, you can see it's quite complex. There's a lot of back and forth, so bear with me while we go through on this. Again, we have to start with some bits which are not part of his narrative timeline, but are indeed related to it. So we actually start with Riversong's Guide to the Dark Times, which gives some information about the great vampires and exactly what their business with the Katura was. And it also is worth noting that Road to the Dark Times includes the episode State of Decay, which is obviously all about the great vampires, and it is worth noting that that gives some more narrative information about them. And then episodes 2 and 5 of Secrets of the TimeLord Victorious, again a little bit of background about the vampires and also Rassilon's involvement with the vampires. But the 9th Doctor's story actually begins here, technically, with what the TARDIS thought of the TimeLord Victorious, because as previously mentioned, the TARDIS uses the time fracture in order to send the Doctor and Rose into the Dark Times, which is where we find ourselves here with Monstrous Beauty. This story sees the 9th Doctor and Rose in the Dark Times into the very, very early days, because they find themselves caught in a battle between the Space Lords of Gallifrey and Commander Rassilon and the Great Vampires. And during the course of the story, Rose herself is turned into a vampire. Luckily, of course, the Doctor saves the day and manages to rescue Rose and make her better. But he has to leave her for a while to recover on a small moon, and that is actually where the first tangent of the Ninth Doctor's story begins, because before Monstrous Beauty ends, in fact, if you're going by the story as it is printed in the Doctor Who magazine, all but the final page and one panel on the preceding page takes place here. It is at this point that the Doctor then goes ahead to the events of Night, the Fool and the Dead, having allied himself with the remaining vampires and making use of them and their coffin ships. He goes to confront the 10th Doctor alongside the 8th Doctor, which then leads into the first part of All Flesh is Grass, and again then sees the 8th and 9th Doctors going off to try and find the 10th Doctor in Tales of the Dark Times. Obviously I've already gone over that story, so that then brings us back to the All Flesh is Grass, but it is at this point that the 9th Doctor once again goes off, and we follow along this time, to Tales of the Dark Times episode 4. Alongside vampire Ichala, the 9th Doctor finds himself on an inhospitable cold planet where they are both attacked by a creature. However, through use of the sonic screwdriver and a little bit of extra help, which I'm going to come back to in a moment, they manage to drive off the creature and await for their ship to come and pick them up again. And it is at this point it is worth noting that we have to do again another slight sidestep over to the Edge of Time. Once again, I would like to thank DoctorBlue for supplying me with the footage of this, because the sonic stake which appears in this Edge of Time TimeLord Victorious update, and which I am actually currently making a prop custom one for those interested, but this sonic stake actually appears in episode 4 of Tales of the Dark Times, so it is worth noting that little sidestep there. Following on from these events, however, the 9th Doctor then travels back to the end of All Flesh is Grass, where alongside the 8th and 10th Doctors they manage to defeat the Daleks and all ends well, before he heads back off to the end of Monstrous Beauty and checks on Rose, and she is recovering well. And that is not quite where his story ends, because there is one final piece, which is the second interlude in The Night, the Fool and the Dead, which sees Rose waking up to the 9th Doctor watching over her, and it is ambiguous, I would say, as to whether this happens just after or during the events of Monstrous Beauty or later on the TARDIS. Now personally, I think this happens later on the TARDIS, because the narrative explains that Rose says she is still not feeling great, which would explain why at the end of this story she is recovered and well again, but obviously still not completely 100%. But either way, that is where the 9th Doctor's narrative ends. So, obviously, that is a lot of information to go through, but that is the complete narratives for the 8th and 9th Doctors for TimeLord Victorious. However, for those just wanting the basic narrative, i.e. without all the parts that aren't necessarily plot-centric and you can skip without missing anything, I'm going to do a quick rundown in each video for the different parts you need to focus on for the individual narratives and the order that you should probably read or listen to them. For the 8th Doctor, we start with the Big Finish stories, The Echoes of Extinction, moving on to He Kills Me Not, followed by The Enemy of My Enemy. We then move on to the book The Night, the Fool and the Dead, followed by All Flesh is Grass, before returning to the Big Finish story, Mutually Assured Destruction, for the end of the 8th Doctor's narrative. And then for the 9th Doctor, it starts with Monstrous Beauty, before moving on to The Night, the Fool and the Dead, and finally, All Flesh is Grass. Now, as I said, it does seem like that's a lot to leave out, given everything I've just discussed. However, if you are just interested in their basic narrative stories, those are the only parts that you really need to focus on. Everything else, while interesting, is really only so much filler. And so there we come to a close of the end of part 1 of A Brief History, a complete guide to the TimeLord Victorious. As I said previously, part 2 will feature the timelines of the 10th Doctor and the Daleks. However, it may be a little bit of a wait before that one comes out. mainly due to the fact that both of them are seemingly directly involved in the events of the Time Fracture event, which is due to begin at the end of May. And as I am unable to attend the event myself, I will be relying on information given to me by others, so once I have researched it and done all the necessary information that I need to do, parts 2 and 3 will follow fairly quickly. For now though, that brings to a close another brief history. As always, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Like, favorite, subscribe, share, it really helps me out a lot. Be sure to description below for a link to my Patreon. I'm doing my very first figure animation and you can get involved. There's exclusive content and rewards for those who do so, and funding my Patreon in any way gets your name at the end of my videos. I salute you all, and I will see you with another video very soon.